Okay, everybody, welcome, Erev Tov. A pleasure to almost see people. And it's a pleasure to welcome Rabbi Yaakov Jaffe back for his, I guess, annual shir, and I'm happy to be here. And he is the principal, I don't know what the official title, principal of Maimonides School, of course, in Boston, and serves as the rabbi. In Maimonides, that's, of course, the shul of Rav Soloveitchik, previously served as the rabbi. So, big shoes to fill, but I know it's an honor. And I believe from when I was there, they still has his seat and nobody sits in his seat. Is that correct?
They still have Rabbi Soloveitchik's Stender.
Still
Um,
Stender. Okay. Okay, very good. And he's a graduate of Yeshiva University, and a degree in comparative literature from Columbia. And it's a pleasure to welcome here to Torah in Motion. Vakasha, Rabbi Jaffe. It's all yours.
okay, good evening, everyone. Nice to see everyone. Um, Parshat Vaera is the parsha that we're going to read this week. Very exciting parsha, which has 7 out of the 10 plagues in it. And what I'm hoping we're going to be able to talk about tonight is not the experience of the Egyptians during the plagues, but the experience of the Jews during the plague. So let's start with a little exercise in, memory and visualizing. Let's imagine for a second that the plague of blood is taking place and you're a Jew. What are you doing during the plague of blood? Are you cheering? Are you staying at home? Is it a snow day? Did they tell you to stay home from work? What if you're a Jew? Are you doing during the plague of blood? I'll take any responses from the crowd, and if not, I'll tell you what I was taught in second grade, and then we'll sort of test whether that stands up. Anyone else want to volunteer? Maybe what they were learned in second grade, what the Jews were doing during the plague of blood?
You're selling your water to the Egyptians.
Okay, very good. So Rachel says we maybe a lot of us heard in the second grade. Jews never lost an opportunity to make a little bit of extra money on the side. So during the plague of blood, what do the Jews do? They're busy getting water because obviously they weren't afflicted by the plague, and they're selling it to the Egyptians. Chaim, did you want to add something?
Yes, I would hesitate to do anything as this is the first plague and you don't know really what's going to be the next reaction of the Egyptians.
Right. So, right, that's a good point. We learned the story that the Jews are trying to make money by selling water to the Egyptians. Maybe the Jews didn't do that because they're worried that the next day the Egyptians would beat them a little bit harder. But the way we were taught when we were younger is that the plague of blood did not apply to the Jews.
That's
But does the Torah say that? Does the Torah say
no,
it didn't apply to blue Jews?
there
I
is
see
no.
Gershon is raising his hand. Well, you're on mute, Gershon. So if you're saying something, I can't hear you. Okay, well, still can't hear. So you can unmute or you can type your answer into the chat. Um,
I'm not saying anything to you.
okay.
I'm My house burned down 2 days ago, and I'm living in a neighbor's house.
Hi.
Ay, Nebuch. I'm so sorry to hear that. So the Torah never says that the plague of blood didn't apply to the Jews. So why is it that we think that the 10 plagues didn't apply to the Jews? Where did that idea come from? Is it just a made-up story?
Only from the fourth and on, it's clear that was not applied. But
Ah,
before that, it's not clear from the Torah. It's not clear.
okay. So Chaim is saying we should look at the Torah, and I'm ready to screen share with everybody here what the Torah actually says. So here we are going to screen share the Torah. And we're going to see why we are used to thinking that the 10 plagues did not impact the Jews. And that's what we see in the plague of Arov and the plague of Dever. And regarding the plague of Arov, which the English in front of you says translates as a mixture of noxious creatures. So we'll assume that that's what it is. It should be highlighted in the screen in front of you. The Torah says, if the Egyptians don't release the Jews, I will send against you this mixture of noxious creatures. But notice it says, in you and your slaves and your nation, Umalu batei Mitzrayim et ha'arov, and the Egyptian houses will be filled with this arov. V'ifleisi bayom ahu eretz Goshen asher ani omed aleha, and I will separate the land of Goshen, where the Jews live, liviltia yot sham arov, that there won't be any creatures there. So by the fourth Makkah, the plague of arov, the text is explicit that it didn't impact the Jews. Moving on to the Makkah of Dever, which is the one in the next chapter, we have the same language. Vifla Hashem ben mikneh Yisrael uben mikneh Mitzrayim. God will separate between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt. V'lo yamud mikol livnei Yisrael davar. And no Jewish cattle will die. So now we have a fascinating debate. If we know that in Makot 4 and 5, the Jews were not affected, what should we say about the other Makot? Do we say, well, the Torah said they weren't affected by 4 and 5, so it must be they were affected by none of the Makot. And that's what we learned in second grade, that when the plague of blood came, the Jews were able to drink clean water from the Nile River. When the plague of frogs came, it didn't go into the homes of the Jews. That's one view, the view of Rashi. We can deduce from what it says by one Makkah to another Makkah. And Ibn Ezra says the exact opposite. Why did the Torah specify by the fourth and the fifth and not by some of the other Makkot? It must be that some of the Makkot affected the Jews just like the Egyptians. Crazy, no? Think about when you were having your Seder last Pesach. Did you say, oh yeah, plague of blood, that impacted our ancestors too. There was no water to drink and our ancestors had to drink blood. But Ibn Ezra says that a totally different way of explaining how the Makos went, but there's a lot of sense to it. Now, can anybody think which Makot? Can anybody think which Makot is? Okay, we have actually a comment in the chat from David Eisen, who is pointing out that it wasn't just Makot 4 and 5 that we know did not impact the Jews, because we have evidence about other Makot too. So I'm going to share the screen again so we could look at some of the other Makot. Here is the Makkah of Choshech, darkness. It says explicitly, Ulachol b'nei Yisrael haya or b'moshevotam. So that's Makkah number 9. It said the Jewish people did not have darkness. And Makkah number 7, the hail, it also says, one moment. Rak be'eretz Goshen shasham b'nei Yisrael lo haya barad. Now, there's one other Makkah that you all know didn't affect the Jews. So we know that 4, the swarm, didn't affect the Jews. 5, the pestilence, the dever. 7, the hail. And 9, the darkness didn't affect the Jews. Which other Makkah didn't affect the Jews? You all know it.
Bechorot, Makat Bechorot.
Makat Bechorot, right? The firstborn Jews didn't die. But so half of the Makot, it says that the Jews weren't affected. Half of them, it says nothing. What do you do with that? Rashi says the Torah doesn't want to be overly repetitive. It said it 5 times. You got the picture. None of the Makot impacted the Jews. And Ibn Ezra says, why does the Torah have to mention it specifically by some? It must be that those Makot impacted the Jews.
would call this not just collateral damage, but co-literal damage, because literature is the same for the Jews as for the Egyptians.
Yes. And that's another way to think about it. Like, think about the makkah, the locust for a second. I mean, what do you think the locusts are going to do? Do you,
Eat everything.
yeah, the locusts are going to eat everything. Do you think the Jews even had their own fields?
No. The question is also why it's the first makkah that it's not that is mentioned is the fourth. So it has to negate the three that came before. If there was a change, it should be mentioned. If the Jews were not affected, it should have been mentioned in Makkah Dam. But it's not mentioned there. So I'm saying that if it comes on the fourth makkah, it means that it's negating the first three.
That's a great point. That wasn't even on my outline. So thank you for that, Dorit.
You're welcome.
If Rashi is right that the Torah said it once, and then we would get the picture and apply it to all of the Makot, then it should have said that by the first Makkah. Then it says it by the first, and then we get the picture from the rest. If it's specifically mentioned, not by the first Makkah, but by the fourth, doesn't that support Ibn Ezra that the first three did impact the Jews?
Right.
Now, many commentaries say that the Makot had different purposes. The first three Makot demonstrate that God exists. The middle three Makot demonstrate that God is active in the world. So you could sort of imagine that the first three Makot, which are just God exists, like small level miracles, God turns the Nile River into blood instead of the sort of super miraculous story that you might have imagined of the cup. When the Jew is drinking its water, he hands it to the Egyptian who drinks, it turns into blood, and then hands it back to the Jew and it's water again. That level of miracle maybe is not what the first three Makot were about. They started small. Then it's only the middle three Makot where God says, okay, Egyptians, I prove to you that I exist. It's after the third Makkah that the Khartoumim, that the Egyptian magicians confess that God exists. And then in the fourth Makkah, Hashem says, we're going to raise the level. And now I am going to differentiate between the Jews and the Egyptians. What does that mean? Does that mean, the sixth and the eighth Makkah, which we haven't talked about that? Do those follow the rule of the fourth? Not entirely clear, but it is a fascinating question. And there seems to be good reason to argue that the first three impacted the Jews. iPad Computer asks in the chat, but the Israelites never complained about the Makot. So that's a good point that, the frogs are coming and they're very annoying and the Egyptians are all complaining. The Jews are not complaining. Why weren't the Jews complaining? I don't have an answer. But if the Jews knew that the Tzfardea was the path towards their freedom, that the Nile turning into blood would be a way that they would eventually be sent out of Mitzrayim, or even if it meant that for a day their Egyptian taskmasters were busy with something else, maybe that's why the Jews didn't complain, even if it affected them. Now, this question, whether or not the Makot impacted the Jews, is a proxy for how you look at the Jewish people at the time. So I'm sure you may have asked yourself this question in the past. The Jews who were in Egypt, were they righteous?
No, not at all.
How do you know they weren't righteous?
They were actually in Mem Tet Sharei Tumah.
Okay, so the Jewish mystical tradition says that they were on the 49th level of impurity, meaning they were not very religiously inclined.
But that's a midrash. You could have another midrash that they were, why were they saved? Because of, they didn't change their names, they didn't do Gilui Arayot, they didn't change whatever. I forget the four things, but no, they didn't change their language, they didn't change their names, lo shinu et shmam, lo shinu et leshonam. לא היה
Clothing.
גילוי עריות, I
Clothing.
forget.
And their
Yeah,
clothes.
clothing.
נכון, and clothing. That's right. So I think that, like, you could look at it in both ways. Maybe they were righteous. That's why they were saved.
So,
But Yechezkel gives us a completely different picture about how
right.
horrible they were.
So, we've got basically a midrash, a mystical tradition, and a pasuk in Yechezkel. And once you have all three of those things, you basically have covered all the bases in Judaism. But the midrash, which says that the Jewish people kept their name and their language, I'm not sure if it says they kept their clothing. We'll have to ask Torah and Moshe to give a shir on that. That's a very controversial issue, whether or not they changed their clothing. That'll have to be a topic for another day, but other people have written about that. But if you say that the Jews were redeemed because they didn't change their names or their language, that's a pretty low bar. And it's not saying that they kept Shabbat. It's not saying that they davened, once a day. We know they didn't do Brit Milah.
Shabbat wasn't given yet.
Shabbat wasn't given yet, but the world had been created.
But nobody had a commandment to keep Shabbat.
Yeah.
So, unless you go לא מוקדם, לא מאוחר בתורה. But no, it's not.
Yeah, I'm not blaming the Jews. I want to add that Ruth mentioned that Yechezkel actually says that when the Jewish people were in Egypt, somebody, and it's not clear who that person was, Amram, Aharon, somebody went and rebuked the Jewish people for bowing down to idols. So we have a large view which says that the Jewish people were, not particularly righteous. Now, iPad Computer says, why am I blaming them for being slaves? And I don't mean to blame them. But the point I'm trying to wonder about is, did the Jewish people deserve to be afflicted by the Makot? Well, the more you say that the Jewish people were righteous, the more you say that the Jewish people did everything that they needed to do, the more you would say, as Rashi does, that the Jewish people did not deserve to be afflicted by the Makot. The more you say that, like Yechezkel says, that they were idolaters, the more you might say that in order to merit, to have the opportunity to be saved, they needed to have a little bit of penance. And so the 10 Makot impacted the Jews as a way for them to be punished for what they did. Obviously, not to the extent of the Egyptians. The Egyptians enslaved the Jewish people and also didn't have an excuse to say that, oh, well, they were slaves, so what do you expect? But maybe the Jews did something wrong, and that's why maybe some of the Makot affected them. And David adds in the chat another important point, that during Makat Bechorot, God says, Jews, you should put the blood on the doorpost because otherwise, you might be affected during Makat Bechorot. So that also seems to imply that the Jews maybe deserved some measure of punishment.
Don't like that.
Now, I know what you're going to say, in that what I just suggested doesn't really fit, because Rashi is one of the people who says that the Jews did not deserve to be saved, and Rashi is the one who says that the 10 plagues didn't affect the Jews. That doesn't perfectly work out, but I think these are two fascinating questions that might be linked. If they're super righteous, then maybe they don't need to be affected by the plagues. And if they have some sins, maybe the plagues are necessary to give them some amount of forgiveness. Chaim?
Could be the fact that they were involved with the three first plagues as due to educational. It was really at the beginning, really Hashem wanted also to test them, to see their reaction to everything. Moshe Rabbeinu, first time he goes to Hashem, when he sends him gives him the mission, and he said, "Ve'im lo yishmeu bekoli." So it's definitely, also after that it's written, "V'lo shamu el Moshe mikotzer ruach v'avodah kasha." They definitely they did not listen. They do not give. They were not in a mood, and they're not in a place to be able to listen. So maybe that was really needed, like a wake-up call.
So I agree that in addition to our pasuk in Yechezkel and our midrashim, the Jewish people's unwillingness to accept Moshe might also support an idea that they needed a wake-up call. Wendy writes in the chat, she doesn't like this, what I just said, that the makot might have been a punishment for the Jews because the makot don't appear like a punishment. Perhaps, Wendy, we could say that the first three makot are not punishments, and maybe that's why they impacted the Jews, because the first three makot, it was annoying for the Egyptians to have blood instead of water, annoying to have frogs, annoying to have lice, but those are all passing conditions. But as you get to later makot, hail destroying their animals, locust eating all of their crops, pestilence, killing their animals also. Those were punishments. And then we could argue that the makot that did not affect the Jews were the punishment makot, because the Jews didn't need a punishment. And the ones that affected the Jews were the first three makot, because the first three makot were the makot which, it's not a punishment. It's not like the Jews have to be saved from that.
But the Jews who were Jewish voice for Palestine might pray to God to stop the plagues.
I think Gershon is reminding us of a statement that Rashi also makes. Rashi says that there were some Jews who did not want to be redeemed, and those Jews died in the plague of Choshech and the plague of darkness, which is another source which sort of relates to this whole question of whether some of the plagues impacted some of the Jews.
I think the question is, what was the goal? What was the objective of the plagues? If the objective of the plagues was, to deal with a pharaoh or to punish the Egyptians, or the plagues were a means to get the Jewish people out of Egypt. So, I also don't like it that you're going that way with a punishment for the Jews. I think it's clear that when Hashem says to Moshe, I'm going to bring 10 plagues or I'm going to bring plagues on Egypt, and in order to show them, it never says anything about the Jewish people. So why would we go and insert something that specifically in the Torah it says why he's sending the makot, and why do we have to add, that to the Jewish people? I'm not following that.
So the plagues are called bishvatim gdolim. Shvatim comes from the word shofet. Literally, shvatim gedolim would be translated as great judgments, which imply that there's some punishment in the plagues. I think on a literary level, we read in Parshat Shemot that the Egyptians drown the Jewish babies, and then the first makkah is the makkah of blood, that the water turns to blood, and the last makkah is makat bechorot, the death of the Egyptian baby. So I don't think it's a crazy idea to say that it's a punishment, but the consensus of the group is that if the Jews were impacted, it was not a punishment. So I will withdraw that because I think that's the consensus of the group. Rachel adds that the purpose of the makot are explicit in the Chumash, Leman teda ki ani Hashem b'karav haaretz. That's a view that the purpose of the makot was educational, that the first three of makot, it says, Leman teda ki ani Hashem, to know that God exists. The next three makot, it says, ki ani Hashem b'karav haaretz, that not only does God exist, but God is b'karav haaretz, in the midst of the land. Namely, God is engaged in the world and not detached and removed. And the last three makot, ki ein kashem Elokeinu, not only is God engaged, but there is nothing like God. God is so different and so special. There is nothing like God. And I do hear that. If that's the way you explain the Makot, then it's easy to explain why they impacted the Jews. Because if it's a punishment, then you're going to ask yourself, well, it's a punishment. The Egyptians deserve a punishment, not the Jews. If the purpose of the Makot are educational to prove the power of God, then it's not a big deal if they impact the Jews, because the purpose of the Makot, as Rachel argues, isn't punishment, so it should only affect the Egyptians. It's educational to know that God exists, and therefore it would be okay if they impacted the Jews, or at least some of them did.
That's true. That's good.
Now, what's amazing is that this machlokas between Rashi and Ibn Ezra about whether the Makot impacted the Jews is linked to a second machloket between Ibn Ezra and Rashi about the duration of the Makot. If you have your video open, show me on your fingers the length and the duration of each Makkah, if you know, and you can show me on your fingers.
I have no idea. There's a fan here.
Okay, Rachel is showing us 7.
7 what?
They were different. They were different. They were not the same.
So let's remember that Rashi is the one who says, if you see something by one of the Makot, by one of the plagues, then it's true for all of the plagues. So let me share my screen again. And we're going to look at the plague of blood this time. And somebody asked me to share it in the chat in addition. So you can also follow the link in the chat if you prefer, or you can just look at the Zoom screen in front of you. It says in the plague of blood, Vayimale Shivat Yamim, 7 days, were concluded. Acharei Kod Hashem et Hayor, after Hashem smit the Nile. Now, by most of the Makot, it doesn't say what the duration was. And Rashi makes the same argument that he made about whether the Makot impacted the Jews. Rashi says, well, if by one of the Makos it says 7, then it must be that every Makkah was 7 days long. Here, Rashi's argument is a little bit better because it's the first Makkah. So if the first plague is 7 days, maybe we just assume that, it said it by the first one, and it's true by all of them. Now, there is one plague which explicitly says that it wasn't 7 days. What is Rashi going to do about that? So when getting to the plague of darkness,
Shlosha yamim. Yeah, that's right. 3, 9. Yeah.
So it says by the plague of darkness,
Shloshet yamim.
Vayei Moshe es yado al hashamayim. Moshe stretches his hand to the heavens. V'hi choshech afela b'chol eretz Mitzrayim shloshet yamim. And there was darkness for 3 days. And then the Torah explains, Lo ra'u ish et achiv. Nobody saw anybody. V'lo kamu ish mitachtav. And nobody stood shloshet yamim for those 3 days. Ulachol b'nei Yisrael haya or b'Moshe v'otam, and all the Jews had light. That doesn't work for Rashi. Rashi told us that each Makkah is 7 days. This one was 3. So then how do you know how long each of the Makkah were? Maybe they were 3 days, like the Makkah of darkness. So Rashi has a solution.
Whatever Rashi's solution is, it looks like as though Hashem is listening to the pleas of the Egyptians in the same way as Trump is listening to the pleas of the Iranians.
There is some interesting, a blackout blackout in the days of Egypt, and we have blackouts today. Except today we have internet blackouts and air traffic blackouts and light blackouts. Does anyone see anything redundant in these two verses, which relates to how Rashi is going to solve the problem of the duration of Choshech? Do you notice how the text says Shloshet Yamim, 3 days, twice? Well, why would that be? We know the Torah is not redundant, and we know that the Torah only needs to tell us once that it was 3 days. So Rashi says these two verses are not one explaining the other. Instead, these two verses are one after another. It's not 3 days of darkness. And then we explain that in those 3 days of darkness, nobody saw or stood up, but that there's 3 days of darkness. The first three were choshech afela, darkness, but maybe you could still move around. And the last 3 days were lo ra'ui shetachiv v'lo kamu ish mitachtav shloshet yamim. They didn't even stand up. 3 plus 3 makes 6. 6 is basically the same as 7. So Rashi says, I stand where I stood. And therefore Rashi says that I stand with my view. Rashi says each of the makos were 7 days. What we know by one makkah, we applied to all of them. But here too, Ibn Ezra disagrees. Can anybody think of a plague that it would be very hard to imagine that it took 7 days?
Makkah Bechorot, no?
Yeah, well, okay.
Makkah
Makat
did not take
Bechorah is
7
obviously
days.
going to be the exception.
It
That
took
one
a
we know
day.
for sure. Even Rashi
But
agrees.
that's the exception, and we're just dealing with the other 9, I
We're
guess.
just dealing with the other 9. But which of the other 9 would be very hard to say that it was a full 7 days? Rachel, if you're talking to us, you're on mute.
Sorry. How about Barad?
Barat is a hailstorm. Can you have a 7-day hailstorm? You could imagine that.
Isn't there something special about the mamtir was it arbe, which is the one that the verb is that he mamtir as if it were creation. I mean, a sort of mamtir verb. Isn't that a special makkah because it uses a special verb? Or am I remembering something I shouldn't be?
I don't know by heart. I'm checking here on the. I think Himtir is by Barad and not by
Yeah.
Arba.
Okay. So that's why I might have agreed with Rachel, because for some reason the mamtir. I know I'm digging this out of something, but I thought that the mamtir verb made the Barad made that plague special. So I was wondering if that would take it out of the general rule.
How did you come up with 7 days?
How does Rashi come up with 7 days? Because
Yes.
by the plague of blood, it says 7 days.
Could the Makkah of Kinim be longer than 7 days? Because you can't get rid of them.
Right. So that's a good point. Like lice, if you have lice, it takes quite a long time to get rid of the lice. Like, why would we want to think that the lice was 7 days long and limit it?
And the boils, by that same reasoning, once you've got the boil, it's not going to miraculously disappear in just a matter of days. It's going to sit there until it resolves.
Yeah, exactly. To say that Barad was 7 days for a hailstorm, 7 days would be a lot for a hailstorm. So maybe we want to limit that. As Sandra mentioned, the Barad, the hail, it does use the word himtir. We have the same word by the man, and the man falls in 7-day units, 6 days and then doesn't fall on Shabbos. Barad reminds us of creation. So maybe 7 days creation by Barad. But why does Rashi feel the necessity to limit all the Makot to 7 days?
That's a very good question. Is he motivated by some amount of compassion? It's possible. If something is never ending, if
it's a punishment, why do you have compassion?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's Rashi. It's thousands of years.
No, my question is, if you're talking about compassion to the Egyptian, if we say it was a punishment to them, so why do we have to use the word compassion at all?
No.
So I can't explain. I don't know why Rashi does what he does. It could be just a general belief in order. And if it says by one Makkah 7, then we should assume that it applies to all 7. The Hebrew for this exegetical principle is Kol davar hashaya b'chlal v'yatza min ha'klal l'lamed lo lamed al atzmo yatza el lamed al klal kulo yatza, which sounds like a mouthful, but it's one of the 13 exegetical principles of Rabbi Yishmael, which some people say every morning. So it could be that Rashi just believes this is the exegetical rule, that everything that applied, that if you have a unit and you say something by one thing in the unit, you must assume it applies to all of them. It could be that it's creation related, that there's a lot of things in the plagues that relate to creation. So Rashi wants to say each plague is 7 days, to their prove, as we talked about before, it proves and demonstrates the truth of creation. So that's why it makes it 7 days. I don't really know what Rashi's thinking was. I just know that it's what Rashi said. It might also be just me, but at least when it comes to the locust, I kind of imagined that was a one-shot thing. I kind of imagined locusts coming. There's so many of them that they block out the sun. What do locusts do? They come, they eat everything that they can eat, and then almost as fast as they come, they leave. Locusts don't really hover in one spot, for 7 days. And after they've eaten everything, why would they stay? So Ibn Ezra says each makkah can be different. They take as long as they take. It can be longer than 7 days. They can be shorter than 7 days. So we have two machlokeses, two debates between Rashi and Ibn Ezra that are really the same. Rashi keeps saying what's true by one is true by all. They all didn't affect the Jews, and they all were 7 days. And Ibn Ezra says, no, they can be different. I just want to add that you don't want the makot to be too long, because the makot cannot be longer than a year. How do I know that the makot can't be longer than a year? I'll go back to the screen share. I'm sorry. Okay, I don't remember where it is. I'm sorry that, here it is. Found it. The Torah says that when Moshe stood before Paro, Moshe ben Shmonim Shana, Moshe was 80, Aaron ben Shalosh Shmonim Shana b'dabram el Paro. The start of the plagues is when Moshe Rabbeinu is 80 years old. So let's do the math. How many years? Oh, Wendy Reback already did the math for us in the chat. So there's 40 years in the desert, and Moshe is 80 when he stands before Paro. If the Makot took longer than a year, we have too many years in Moshe's life, because Moshe only lived to be 120. So you can't say that the plague of blood was for 2 months and the frogs were there for a month and a half, and then there was lice for 3 months, because if it gets to be more than a year, we're missing a year in Moshe's life. Even, by the way, as it is, we seem to be missing a year in Moshe's life, because if he's at 80 at the start of the Parsha, And then Parshat Vaera takes a year. He'd be 81 at the end of the Parsha. And then he would have died at age 121. Maybe that's actually a proof for Ibn Ezra. Maybe that's a proof for Ibn Ezra, who says, no, the whole thing took only 2 months. And that way Moshe can be 80 at the start of the Parsha, and he can still be 80 at the end of the Parsha, and 120 when he dies. Otherwise, we're short a year of Moshe's life. If you have Rashi's view, then Rashi says that the Makot were about a week each, and then there was time in between the Makos. So Rashi says the whole thing together is a year. And I've never really seen a good answer to this question. How could the Makos have taken a year? Then we're missing a year in Moshe's life.
Could it be an average of 7, some more and some less?
So that might be what Ibn Ezra would say, that they averaged out to be 7 days.
Because then it makes sense. If it's a 10 of them, and we know some of them took only a day. Let's say Makat Bechorot, we know it's a day. It's not 7 days. Because in the same day he told them, he kicked them out and sent them to go. So if we're talking about that, if it's a 70 days is 2 months and a bit.
So Rashi doesn't think it's averages. Rashi says very clearly each Makkah is 7 days. There's 3 weeks in between each of the 2 Makkot. So then each Makkah, when you factor in the 7 days of the plague and the 3 weeks before, each one is a month. There are 10 plagues. They take about a year. That's what Rashi says. It's based on the Mishnah and Ediot. The Mishnah and Ediot says that the duration of the plagues, basically Parshat Vaera, took about a year.
What do you take that are 3 weeks between each Makkah and Makkah?
That's what Rashi says.
No, but there are some in the text itself. He comes and he says, "Lemachar ani mevi oto."
Yeah, Rashi says it was 3 weeks in between each plague.
Okay.
There are lots of problems with this Rashi. If Rashi is right that each Makkah took a month, so let's say the Makkah of Choshech took a month, so then the Makkah of Choshech took the month of Nisan. And then before Choshech is Arbeh. So then the month of Arbeh, the Makkah of Arbeh took place in Adar.
Yeah.
If that's true, the Makkah of Barad took place in Shvat, this time of year. But why is it surprising to argue that Barad took place this time of year in the Makkah of Shvat? I'll screen share again the Makkah of Barad, and let's see how that relates to the length of time for each Makkah. It says that when Barad came,
Oh my God.
the flax and the barley were broken. Aviv, the barley is ripe earlier in the year. And the flax, both of them had strong stalks. So because they had strong stalks, when the Barad came, it smashed the stalks. But that's not true of the wheat and the spelt wheat, ki afilot hena, because they ripened later, so they were still green and soft. So according to Rashi, the Makkah of Barad took place during Shvat. To argue that the wheat was already sturdy and that the barley was already sturdy and the wheat was soft in the month of Shvat, that seems like hard to imagine. I'm not an expert in the agriculture of ancient Egypt, so maybe it's true. But there's a lot to be said for the Ibn Ezra that the Makot took a lot shorter and they were in a much more compressed period. This also goes back to what we were talking more about punishments. If it's a punishment, you'd want the Egyptians to endure it for a long time, to endure the punishment. If it's just a sign to show that God exists, then you understand why. If you understand that if it's just to show that God exists, they don't need to be that long. God can make a magical hailstorm with fire in the hail, and you see it for a day, and it does the trick. Okay. I got one more application of our core question, but before they do that, we have a comment in the chat from iPad Computer that 80 could just mean 80th year. That is probably the best solution that Rashi would give. Rabbi Kelman also suggests maybe 79 could be rounded to 80, like in Parshat Vayigash. Some opinions say there were 69 souls who went down to Egypt and it's rounded to 70. So there are a lot of possible answers to Moshe's age question. Probably at your Shabbos table of the Shabbos, you'll have a more fruitful discussion if you say, did the plagues impact the Jews, than if you say, we're missing a year of Moshe's life, we have to find it. But there are three answers. There are a bunch of answers to that question. 79, but we're rounding. It's not really 80, it's into the 80th year. Or Ibn Ezra, the Makot must have been less time, and that's how we make up for the missing year in Moshe Rabbeinu's life. Okay, my last one of these questions, Rashi doesn't talk about this one, so we can only guess what Rashi would have said, relates to the question of whether Moshe prays to end the Makkah. So by some of the Makot, we have the sort of, conventional story that we're used to hearing, right? The advisors go to Paro and say, we can't bear it anymore. Paro goes to Moshe and says, Moshe, stop the plague. Moshe says, I don't control the plague. God control the plague. Paro says, can you pray on our behalf? And then Moshe prays. So Moshe prays by a bunch of the Makot. I'll share the screen again, and we'll see. Moshe prays to end the frogs. Moshe says, I will now pray. Paro says, I'm going to go and pray. Paro says, pray that they should end the next day. Regarding the Makkah of Arov, we have the same thing. Paro says, Ha'atiru ba'adi, pray on my behalf. So Makkah 2, the frogs, and Makkah 4, the Arov, the noxious animals, Moshe prays. Does not play, as far as we know, by the pestilence. By the way, it says by the pestilence that it was mimacharat. That suggests that the pestilence was a one-day plague. Anyway, there's no playing about the boils. And then in the Makkah of Barad, it says, Ha'tiru el Hashem, praise to Hashem, v'rab biyod kolot elokim uvarad. So we have Moshe praying by the frogs, the Arov, and the Barad. So we're going to ask our same question. What do we learn from that? Are we learn from that if Moshe prayed by 3 of the Makot, then we should deduce that he prayed by all of them. There was blood, Paro said pray, and Moshe prayed. There was lice, Paro said pray, and Moshe prayed. There was an animal plague, the plague was spreading, Hashem said to Moshe pray, and Moshe prayed.
Rabbi,
I don't think Rashi says that explicitly, but that would be a reasonable guess.
Didn't we see this with Avraham and Avimelech when Avraham was either told to pray for Avimelech or prayed on his own for the plague, God's punishment to Avimelech to end? So do we extrapolate forward, and that whenever there's a tyrant and we have to punish them and this and that, it's a Kiddush Hashem, so to speak, for God's chosen to have the ability to alleviate the Makkah? In other words, is that a pattern that we should be looking for?
That's an interesting point. I want to point out that whenever Moshe prays, Paro seems to ask him first.
And maybe God wants that.
Right. Maybe God says, I don't need you to pray before the enemies of God have recognized him. But after Paro recognizes God, then it is a Kiddush Hashem that Moshe prays and the plague stops.
Right. And Abraham did it with Abimelech too. So I'm just wondering if perhaps it's something that's there that we should recognize.
Yeah.
This is a part of the education. Kidu Kenya Hashem, you have to do that way. He has to come to you and ask you to pray. Otherwise, he's going to continue to be stubborn and not let them go.
Yeah. I think that's fair. I think Ibn Ezra would say that Moshe did not pray for every plague, especially if Ibn Ezra says that pestilence and locust was a one-shot deal. There's no need for prayer because the Makkah could have been an hour. It could have been, a short thing. I also find it hard to imagine that Moshe was asked to pray about the darkness because the text is explicit that the Egyptians did not, did not stand up or anything. So I find it hard to imagine if they didn't stand up that they would have asked Moshe to pray. But this is a third example of a case where we could argue that all the Makkot were the same and every Makkah ended with Moshe's prayer. Or we could say the ones that the Torah specifies that he prayed, and all the other ones he did not, possibly because the other ones were a very short duration. So I want to summarize what we did tonight, and I want to point out that we learned about the plagues, and we also learned methodology of how to study Torah. We learned about the plagues, and that you could talk about at your dining room table, features of the plagues, and seeing how features of specific plagues, did they apply to all the plagues the same? And were the Jews punished? That's a fascinating question. Was Moshe asked to pray? How long was it? So that's the content that we learned. We also learned a methodology. Whenever you study Chumash, what do you do if you have a list or a unit, and there's a detail by one member of the unit and not the rest? You find this all the time when we discuss sacrifices, such as in Parshat Vayikra, or when we discuss holidays, such as in Parshat Emor. Do we assume that the details apply to everything? Or do we say wherever the detail appears, it applies. Wherever it doesn't appear, it doesn't apply. That's a very important methodological question to keep in your head. And this topic is one of my favorite topics in the Tanakh because it gives us fascinating content about the Parsha, but also a methodology. Now, while we're talking about methodology, iPad Computer notes in the chat that it seems as though Rashi and Ibn Ezra are using logic over here, and they are using their logic. Some of what Rashi says seems to be some midrashic tradition, but Rashi often, will not follow a midrash if he doesn't think it appeals to his logic. So I think they are using logic. And iPad asks, should we use our own logic? And my answer to that is that we should, but we should also have a little bit of humility. Rashi and Ibn Ezra both knew the entire Tanakh by heart. If there was a pasuk in Tehillim which maybe suggests that the Jews were affected or not affected, Rashi and Ibn Ezra would know about it. We might not. So, I think it's valuable to use our logic. And I think that this evening together, we have used our own logic and trying to assess between Rashi and Ibn Ezra, which do we like best. But with a little bit of humility, recognizing that there are things that we might miss. Yes, iPad adds, we stand on their shoulders too. There's grammar details that we might miss. But I do support the idea of using our logic as we try to address these questions. I see we have 4 minutes left, so I'll open the floor to any parting questions or last thoughts before we wish everybody Shabbat Shalom. Any final questions in the last 4 minutes?
When you look at methodology, and you have lists, for example, that are detailed and they're repetitive. For example, sacrifices that the Nesi'im brought, and they're all the same, but they're repeated one after the other. So when you see lists like that, and then lists that are not full, and then only the first one, would you be able to generalize from that something as a methodological way of dealing with this question? Because that, I think, is a fascinating question. So how do you differentiate when there is a detailed list and then there isn't?
So in 4 minutes, I can't answer that question, although maybe we'll ask Rabbi Kelman that whoever gives the Parshat Naso class address that issue. But you're making a great point. In the Nisiim, the sacrifices of the leaders of the tribes in the 7th chapter of Bamidbar, they are verbatim identical.
Right.
So we should say that when they're not verbatim identical, there must be that there are differences. But yeah, when you look at the sacrifices, there are differences between certain descriptions of fats, and Rashi generally says the fats are the same. This one didn't mention the kidney, this one didn't mention the liver, whatever, it's the same for all of them. Why does Rashi think that? And how does Rashi explain for why sometimes the details are exactly the same by everything and sometimes they're not? That is a great question. I don't really have a great answer.
Can I suggest the Parshat Naso and the Nisi'im, because one of my son's the Bar Mitzvah Parsha, we agonized over all of that. Maybe it's to make, at least he thought, maybe it's to make each of the Nisi'im feel special. And if you said, okay, et al, or etc., or ditto on that, or the same thing he did, it's a little demeaning. And maybe each person has to feel special, that his gift, even if it's the same dollhouse as the one before or the same bicycle, it was given with the same amount of love and attention and care. And maybe that's why you have to repeat each and every one.
I like it. That works.
That's beautiful.
We'll have to wait for Naso.
Okay. Come back for Naso. You've got a hot audience.
All right. Tova, you remember I spoke about this at Josh's bar mitzvah, if you remember. Okay, with that, my nephew's bar mitzvah, that was 25 years ago. That's what I spoke about a little bit, but I won't go into it now. But anyways, and as I mentioned, please God, Shoshana Schechter is giving the shir on Parshat Naso, so I did look that up. So, all right, any other questions, comments? Thank you. I do think that's a fascinating question. And the Shabbos table, whether Jews drink in Egypt, whatever, the makwat. So, thank you very much. And all right, if no final questions, Yasher Koach, and we look forward to learning with you in the future. And okay, wish you good things, and thank you very much. Laila Tov, Shabbat Shalom. Tomorrow, of course, I will have my Parsha Shir, my shir on the Siddur, my weekly shir at 9:25. Rabbi Liebtag, of course, kicks off the week as he does every week at 11:15, and pretty soon we'll be having like 11, 12 classes a week as we add a couple more classes to our general winter series. So please be on the lookout. And I want to wish everybody well. Please invite a friend to come and learn. And Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Rabbi Kelman, for hosting me
pleasure.
this week.
Thank you. Okay. And all the best. Okay. Boston's a nice place. It really has been a while since I'm there, but it's a nice community. But
Hello.
I think the most...
לגמרי, היה כיף.
כן, היה כיף, אבל בסדר, שומעים כל אחד, הם מדברים אחר שיעור, כמה יפה זה מצוין. Okay, thank you, Drorit. Okay, בבקשה. Okay, everybody, we will...
My pleasure.
Okay, that's good.
I missed a lot of classes for a while.
Mesiach Lepitumo, that's it.
Yeah, נכון, but it was nice that you heard it. I didn't even mean that you...
I thought you speak in French, I thought when you're not talking here, you speak in French,
No,
Montreal doesn't rub off on you.
No, I speak שלא שינו את לשונם. Come on, I speak Hebrew.
By the way, I didn't post it, but years ago I wrote one of my articles, my Divrei, I quoted that famous medrash: the Jews didn't change their name, their language, and their clothing. And Rabbi Eli Fisher lives in Modi'in.
Right.
He wrote me a little note, and he showed me his article. I can actually forward it. That no such midrash exists. And he traces how that error happened. And great rabbis put that on.
How did it come about?
So let me just find the article. Wait half a minute, and I'll send it. He quotes it had to do with the
Can you
reform
send it?
movement. Yeah, I'm going to put it in the chat box.
You
If
know what?
if
Because I put it in a curriculum.
Yeah.
So
So
I'm not happy
I'm
about
glad
that.
he read my Dvar Torah and he sent me a little correction, and I, thanked him. And here it is. I hope. Yeah, they not change your name. Yeah, the life cycle of a peculiar midrashic variant. So that's Eli Fisher, who I said he used to try. I don't know. I think he translated the Pnei Halach into English. I think that's one of the things he was doing. He's in Modi'in. I mean, he's from here. Here, I don't know exactly.
He's a
American.
Baltimore boy.
Oh, he's a
Rabbi
Baltimore
Jay is
boy.
from Baltimore.
I didn't. I'm sorry. We had him speak Torah Motion live, in the pre-COVID days. We did have him once. I've only met him once live, and he spoke for us a few times online. I forgot or didn't know he's from Baltimore. Okay. Baltimore and Boston, the East and West from New York.
Look,
Whatever.
the funny thing is that I was in Israel. I was in Yerushalayim for one day in December, and who did I bump into in the old city and the Muslim shuk?
Eli Fisher.
Eli Fisher.
Yeah,
So
no,
it
he's a
must
good.
be, it must be
Okay. So it's a
Bashir
fascinating.
taking
I have to reread it now. I mean, when you were talking about it, so I went looking for the article, and then because I remember it from years ago, but now I have to reread the article. And I see that Ari Zivotofsky has an article about this also in Jewish Action. So it's funny how certain midrashim become very famous even if they don't exist. So,
I think the most fascinating thing about Rashi's opinion is the possibility that the Jews for Palestine prayed that God remove the plague of blood because it affected them, just like the Jews that we have today.
I'm sorry, I didn't get all of that, what you said. I don't know if you're asking me or Rabbi Jaffe.
Rashi says that the Jews suffered from the first plague. And what I find most fascinating about that opinion of Rashi is if they did suffer, were there Jews who prayed on behalf of Pharaoh of Mitzrayim because they were like the Jews for Palestine today?
So, we talked about how there are some Jews who didn't want to leave. Maybe that's the same. I don't know, but I haven't read every midrash, and we can open up Shmot Rabbah and see. Dasan and Aviram seem to, not. They seem to not want to leave. They seem not want to support the Jews. It might be a mystery. It might be, we don't know.
That's the most fascinating detail of your fascinating Torah, I think.
Gershon, maybe the Jews from Palestine are not really Jews.
Why do you say that?
Because.
Okay. Jack, what do you want to say?
I want to say that the Jews for Palestine, most of them are not really Jews.
Oh,
that's
I don't want to get into I will leave the political part out. If you're talking, biological, that's a different question. But I assume many of them are Jews. I don't know, but I'm sure there are many Jewish Egyptians, who are on the side of the Egyptians. Why not? Like, why wouldn't that be? Like, it's always the case. That's what I would think.
Some of them even had Canadian nationality, maybe.
That I don't know back in Egypt, but hard to tell. But anyways, yeah.
Well, the majority of Jews stayed in Egypt, right? They chose to stay.
Yeah, according to the Midrash, the majority stayed. That's a necessary, right? I mean, the Netziv writes in his commentary to the Haggadah, this idea that it was terrible. That's not so true either. That's I don't want to say it's distorted, but that's one aspect. For some people, many people, life was good in Egypt. I mean, when the Jews say in Egypt, and that's we want to go back, we remember the fish and all those wonderful things. Nobody says we want to go back to Auschwitz. Nobody says that, but they said they want to go back to Egypt. So they weren't lying. I mean, they weren't lying, and for some people, they were serving noble and all these wonderful people. And it's all, why go to a desert? It's always, just a lot of people live under authoritarian regimes, and that's what they know. That's what they like. They don't not everybody in Iran is rising up. That's the problem. Not enough people rose up so they could quash the revolt. People, you get used to it. It's great. They give us what we need, whatever. So I don't know. It's complicated. Politics.
It's complicated.
It's complicated. Life is complicated. Rabbi, you should have the last word. I don't want to,
1 minute, Rabbi Kelman, I found the source. It says Shir Shirim Rabbah Pei Daled, and it says בזכות ארבעה דברים נגאלו בני ישראל.
Right. That's a different
שלא
message.
שינו את שמם, but that's what I was looking for. שלא שינו את שמם, לא שינו את לשונם, לא אמרו לשון הרע, ולא נמצא בהם אחד פרוץ בערווה. זה מה שאמרתי, גילוי עריות. So I remembered
That's exactly the point. Those three, but the three, language, speech, and clothing, does not exist in one midrash. This one's in this midrash, this one's in another midrash. You'll never find all three. That
does not mention clothing. The Shir Shirim Rabbah doesn't mention that they didn't change their clothing.
No, that's right. It mentioned לשון הרע וערווה. That's right.
Yeah,
that's why I didn't know that.
By the way, you'll see at the end of the article, I just scanned it for half a second, the end of Eli Fisher's article, he said they didn't change their language. That wasn't Hebrew. They spoke, there was like a Yiddish Egyptian. He said, in other words, what Jews do is they corrupt the language. They turn German into Yiddish and Spanish into Ladino. They turn the Egyptian into who knows what. And that's what they didn't change.
I don't believe that. I don't believe that.
I'm not saying I believe that either. That was said by the sons of Rebbe, I think. I'm not saying I believe it. I'm just saying that,
because they spoke Yiddish, so they're trying to contaminate.
Of course, I understand that.
All those are called Ha'ivriot. That means they were speaking Ivrit.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, presumably it means they were speaking Hebrew, of course. I say because it's so startling and so.
Even the name.
I have to run, everybody.
Yeah, Rabbi, you run. I'm sorry. Yeah. This is the post-game show. Extra innings.
Everyone. And Amir Tashem, maybe next year as well.
Okay. Be well, everybody. Yeah. Okay. Laila Tov. It's good.
Laila Tov.
Okay. Shit Shabbos. Laila Tov.
Laila Tov. Toda Rabba.
B'vakasha.